Sorry, I'm going to talk about how inequalities are being paved over in a data-driven education system, and this is a project based in the UK and England. So both affiliations are here because I just changed jobs last week to move to Berlin, so I'm kind of in the liminal academic space still with this project, but also moving. So through examining the narratives of some people working, some educational leaders working in the sector in England, I want to show how the system is both compressing and manufacturing new practices and subjectivities. And data is strongly seen by a lot of them as telling a true story, giving a real measurement, getting to create some real visibility, yet in this process a lot of other things are being obscured and inequalities reproduced. And so England as a nation state education system has a bit of a data obsession. Jenny Osga has documented how it has the most advanced, and she's not saying this particularly positively, collection system for educational data in Europe. We have lots of data being generated through Ofsted inspections. It's the inspectorate for schools, the routine testing of students, public ranking of schools. And she writes about how it's a system governed by numbers. And since the early, the 1980s, we've had to move away from kind of rule-governed, centralized legal framework governed by professionalism towards a system more goal-oriented towards outputs, outcomes, target monitoring. And it felt in the research that there was a really strong relationship between this proliferation of data as a disciplinary mechanism, gauging outcomes, and increased feelings of anxiety, dissatisfaction, and relentless speed amongst the teachers and students and leaders in my research. And just to think first with Betty, who was a teacher in a secondary academy in London, she was saying we've just got an outstanding Ofsted, so the school was rated outstanding. But and she says, you know, it'd be nice to have a little time to say, you know, great, we did a really great job, well done us. But instead it's like, what's next? How can we get to the next level? Or what can we do to bring other people to that level? And this kind of relentless exhaustion, the constant need for progression, with an end destination that wasn't often clear, and was continually elusive, and even in favorably rated, very successful schools like Betty's. And Stephen Ball has written about how this is an aspect of neoliberal subjecthood, where we're constantly incited to invest in ourselves, work on ourselves, improve ourselves. And this is true for both teachers and students, where teachers' pay is linked to the performance of their students often. And Stephen Ball calls this a social dislocation, these sorts of changes. They're not just administrative or managerial, but they're also changing people's social relations with each other. So I want to explore some of the contradictory and detrimental social effects that this turn to governance by numbers has precipitated. So just briefly, flushing the wrong computer, that's going to help. So in the English educational landscape, very briefly, we had kind of this close relationship with the US, and the Thatcher's turn towards regular testing, publishing results, league tables. Since the early 2000s, the huge thing has been the move towards academies and multi-academy trusts, which has happened very quickly. And so that most schools in England are now academies, are part of multi-academy trust, which is a group of academies led by a CEO and a governing board of trustees. And these schools are essentially taken completely out of local democratic control and function as small businesses, making their own contracts, conditions, sometimes curriculum. So we have a lot of fragmentation. And the data that I'm referencing is from two projects. One was an ethnographic study of a very successful academy, well, deemed very successful academy, and then the second postdoc project, Governing Schools, Governing Subjects, that I just recently finished, and that was more focusing on multi-academy trusts and how those are working. So this process is not just one of compression, but production. And we see Mr. Culford, he's a teacher, head teacher of Dreamfields Academy, which I called it, saying how they'll live or die by the first set of results the school gets, and those are around age 15, the GCSE. And they had to be good to ensure the school's survival. And this teacher is part of Mr. Culford's senior management team, saying the end product is the school so disciplined, everything works. it's a well-oiled machine, so it's kind of literally pumping out the right sorts of data, and it did do very well with its results, and yeah, so that worked out for them. But then we have a lot of paving over of other concerns, a little more nuanced concerns, regarding excessive disciplinarian approaches being taken in a lot of these schools, particularly in schools in urban areas, very undemocratic school takeovers and how they're run subsequently, overworked teachers, high staff turnover. So a lot of moral and ethical concerns are over techniques of how we get this success is suspended in the face of this great data that comes in. So that's a picture of one of these very strict schools in London where they walk in silence in single file in the corridors. And that's a teacher from Dreamfield saying, you know, the ethos, which was structure liberates, it seems to be working. So I'm not sure, is it right, is it wrong, are the kids mistreated? And then he says, I don't think the shouting's right, where it seems you almost want to harm a child, I don't think that's necessary. But then Ms. Hatcher has the kind of also contradictory feeling about this. When she started, she felt it was really horrible, but now it's difficult when you can see the fruits of what Dreamfields has produced and how much it works. It makes you think, well, is that aggressive discipline justified? And she found it difficult to begin with, and she still does. So those sorts of qualms can be sort of submerged in this data. And it's, as I said before, this discipline is often directed at ethnic minority and working class student bodies who are seen to be needing it to get this data. And I had a couple of other multi-academy trust employees. Abigail was talking about, she says, pupil outcomes is what convinces people, no matter what they think or believe. So they might have had problems coming in with us taking over their school, but once they see the data, they're going to sign up for it. And Alex at a chain, a very big, popular chain in England called, I'm calling Big Matt, says there's a feeling that success almost speaks for itself in a sense. So success is success, and success is results, results are success, and this kind of validates itself. And part of this socially as well is the value of this, what have I done? The middle class buffer zone as seen as a group of students who definitely are going to make the right data for the school, and how you need them. Ms. Rainwhite talks about you need this group of kids. They might have gotten sent to private school, but instead they'll come here and they're going to help us achieve our targets. And Diane Ray talks about that with her colleagues. That says she says that in this sort of target-driven culture, this white, not always white, but often white middle-class child is seen as valuably helping a school meet their target. Although this might not promote equality, they are necessary for institutional survival. And that creates some conundrums for teachers like Ms. Wainwright, who isn't entirely comfortable with that. And there's also, and I just wanted to turn to look at some of the places that people go who aren't making the right data and are disrupting the production of it. And these people can be sort of paid over by sending them to places like the Learning Support Unit. And this is a complex behind the Dreamfields Academy near the rubbish bins where children work in silence in these sorts of porta cabins. And these are very popular in lots of schools. They're not monitored as such by any kind of external agency. So they're a way of getting pupils out of class without the school actually having to formally exclude them or write any of that down. That's another cooling offcell in a school in the north of England that they were using. And so I'll just tell them, go back to Big Matt for a moment, who I found in my recent project. They were using some more extreme tactics of excluding pupils through illegal means. This chain has been praised by the government for its high test results, for turning around schools, but the poor and often illegal practices were an open secret when I was talking to a lot of the other head teachers. And I spoke particularly to one attendance officer at a local authority in London called Marcus, and he told me the story of how Big Matt had opened a school in his borough, taking it over, and all of a sudden he kept getting all these requests for people to be homeschooled, and finally got to the point of the story where the children were being sent home with some work and coded as a code B, which means they're being sent to another institution to be educated. Instead, they were actually at home on their own with a folder. And then after a while, the parents would call and say, you know, can they come back to school? And the head would say, well, not really, but I think you should homeschool and then you could get into another school faster. They said, okay, well, so, and the kids would be brought back to the school and the teachers would often be waiting with the printed out letter saying, I would like to homeschool under Section 42 of the Education Act, blah, blah, blah. And they would sign it, the school would post it for them to the local authority, to Marcus, and they would be officially able to off-roll them. And so Marcus, over the course of a year, noted that 200 children had been moved from this one secondary school. He brought it to the attention of the director of the local authority, who said, the results are really good in so many ways in not dealing with it. So he says the director was quite culpable in allowing lots of these children to leave their school, and the sacrifice was those children to improve Big Mount's results because they'd taken over this failing school. And so they have 75% 5A-C GCSE, which is quite high. So it's a remarkable achievement, but in that strapline it doesn't mention they sent 200 of them to other schools. Thank you. So small problem, but a way to get the right data quickly. And so just look a bit about the discipline of data and audit with teachers. And this is Dominic speaking. He's a relatively new CEO of a trust. He's saying it's very interesting because at the beginning, being someone from a non-educational background, there was a bit of resistance, but ultimately it's about process and management, holding people accountable, achieving targets. And he talks about how he's come from sales and he's instituted the kind of similar structure that he was working with there. And he doesn't see any problem in equating the process of working with children as product or selling another good as a product. It's still a part of the same process. And there are a lot of teachers who railed against this and that their pay was being attached to this target. And there were a few heads in the sample that resisted this, like Jemima, who didn't use performance-related pay at all, but she ran a very secure school that was already in a position that she could kind of take, and she recognized that as herself. So we have a lot of exhaustion and disillusionment, and a very high turnover rate. 4 out of 10 teachers are quitting within 5 years of qualifying. And Diana, she was a primary head who was saying, I've decided as a head, you're only as good as your last set of data, so I'm not very good at the moment because of her last stats. And she was doing a very innovative approach in a rather deprived area of London. And then I noticed she was gone within a year from her headship. So that happens quite a lot. So I guess those stats didn't improve. And another teacher, Hannah, was told, she said she's told by Ofsted to be data-driven and agrees that data can be great, but at no point is it focused on the needs of the student. And she found this a real problem because it was frustrating. You could do an amazing job, they could achieve a lot and learn lessons, but then be told you haven't made any progress. And that there's driving people away. So you either say you either have to decide you don't care that it's data-driven, but for people who do care about the quality of education, it's a big deterrent. That said, I was trying to find some positive moments here of teachers still looking back to some sort of magic moments of education where they're trying to preserve this sort of more unquantifiable notion. Dora talks about the kind of esoteric part of education where there's magic moments. Arnold, also a head teacher, talks about a holistic view of happiness outside of this narrow academic side. And Jemima also says about how there's lots of things that go on every day in schools that aren't measurable, and those are still the point of school and very important. Yet, still, it was interesting, they didn't really ever tie the sort of structures they were working within to the fact that they had these sort of challenges. That I think it was very naturalized to sort of move in the 80s and 90s towards this system has become quite hard to think outside of. And just a concluding thought, I was thinking of Courtney, McGinity and Gunter have written a book about educational leadership, and they talk about how theory becomes a distraction from the business of securing the delivery of these quantitative outcomes. And they suggest that it's only by not thinking too hard or theoretically about things that educational leaders can actually fulfill their role and enable an increasingly totalitarian performative regime. And this came through in my interviews because the really busy nature of this post of being a head or a CEO means there's just not much time for critical thinking about what they're doing actually does. And there's just time to implement and try to keep up with changing policy, funding pressures, and to not allow their school to sink under the pressure of this landscape. And there's a huge pressure to generate data by often whatever means is possible, and that's very dependent on the moral and ethical standpoint of the head or the CEO. Although this altruistic model of the school was often sort of clung to in the background, despite it actually being fading or mostly wholly absent from the present. And I was trying to think of a positive note to end on here. And I was thinking about the role of time, perhaps, and about anthropologist Marilyn Strathland's work in Tyranny, Transparency, and amongst other great stuff she's done. But thinking about the time in relation to data production and how measurement regimes might be frustrated through the slowing down of this pace of time and the breaking of this relentless cycle of acceleration into a future without any kind of in-point or careful theoretical consideration. And she talks about how with teaching, and this came through in a lot of the teachers' interviews, how it takes a very long time for learning to manifest itself, and it often doesn't come out the way it went in. And it's very hard. You might try to direct something, but the act of inspiration is necessarily transient. It's very hard to capture. And pointing to the difficulty of measuring it and the need to continually pay attention to the qualities that defy it, despite of this landscape. Ended there, thanks. Thank you.